You're listening to episode 122 of Mitolife Radio. I'm Matt Blackburn. It's been a while since I've done a solo show, and I've had a bunch of requests to do one about homesteading, and specifically the mistakes that I've made in my homesteading journey. And I'll be focusing largely on goats and chickens, because that's what I had the most experience with. And hopefully I can save you guys some headache and money buying stuff that you don't need. So last year we got some Nubian, Nigerian hybrid goats, and I was milking them by hand and one udder at a time. A lot of people can do two at a time, and that's where you really make it efficient. But if you do one udder at a time, it took me about 20 minutes to completely drain all the milk from the udders. So it was quite the process, and my hand would get very tired after that. So eventually I found a machine called the Ultimate Easy Milker, and that took several months on Facebook, just scouring forums and stuff to find this device, because there are a lot of milking machines out there, but this one called Utterly Easy, it's about $700 US, but totally worth it. Instead of 20 minutes now, it takes me 2 minutes per udder. So it's very fast, and you just have to make sure that the equipment is clean. The mistake I've made with that device is letting it overflow while I was multitasking, and it was hooked up to the doe's udder, the female goat, it's called a doe, and it would actually overflow into the container, and the milk would actually fill up the tubes. It's like a vacuum suction thing. And if you don't clean out those silicone tubes, then you actually get mold. Like I had black mold growing in them. So really important to keep things clean, because if you don't, then you'll have not the best quality milk. So if you're milking by hand, nails trimmed, clean hands, and you actually wipe down the udders first with a towel or with baby wipes. We use Kirkland Signature baby wipes. And a lot of people will squirt each teat like 2 to 3 times just to clear out any dirt or to look for blood or for discolored milk. And that's an option that seems to be pretty standard in the industry. I don't know if it makes a difference having less goats versus a huge herd where you have more chance for infections and things with a bigger population. And I get quite a few questions about food and grain. And a lot of my messaging with Mitolife is against PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids. But when we're talking about ruminant animals with multiple stomachs and a rumen, it's a completely different animal. Literally, it's a different digestive tract. And so animals like ruminants can actually convert polyunsaturated fatty acids, long chain fatty acids like omega-3s, into SFAs, saturated fatty acids. Humans do not have that ability. We either have to burn the PUFAs as fuel, which damages the mitochondria in that process, or the PUFAs get stored in our tissues and then they cause issues later on. So it's either immediate issues or long-term issues when we consume polyunsaturated omega-3 fats. But with goats, they can actually convert it. So a lot of people think grains are bad for goats or for dairy animals. No, they're actually not bad. It's natural. It's what they would get in the wild. When a plant goes to seed, they would eat grain in nature. So it's not a natural. I would say just avoid soy. I think corn is okay, non-GMO corn, but avoid soy. And we use a local feed producer here, grain producer. And all it takes is 1 or 2 cups a day. You don't have to give them much. The majority of their diet for male goats, called bucks, is going to be grass. And for the females, for the does, the majority of their diet is alfalfa. or second cutting alfalfa, and they can eat timothy grass, but it's more of like potato chips. It's not really nutrition. They love it, but they should predominantly be on alfalfa. But if you give the males, the bucks, alfalfa, it will actually potentially clog their urinary tract and cause a lot of issues. So the males must eat grass. They cannot be on alfalfa. And that took a while to learn. And I was sold for a little bit on this stuff called chaff hay, which is supposedly, the best, and it's really expensive, and it's fermented with molasses. And I was really excited about that. But then I kept seeing mold in them. Maybe I just wasn't storing them right, but we switched over to just simple compressed bales of hay and picking up maybe 8 of each at a time. So 16 total, just filling up the truck bed. Eventually probably want to get a cart. And that lasts a good amount of time. And another thing that I learned, trial and error, we're using the hay feeders, like the giant hay bale feeders, like the metal, if you can picture like a V shape. And I was throwing a whole bale of hay in that thing. And what happened is the bucks and the does were actually jumping on top of it, sleeping on top of it, pooping on top of it. And if they poop on their hay, they're not going to eat it. And if it falls on the ground, they're not going to eat it. So the feeding apparatus, the container that they feed out of, is really important. And we started with plastic, kind of hang over the fence, or kind of like bucket style, like usually red or blue, like this square bucket with 2 hanging things that you could just hang it on a fence. And that still wasn't ideal. And so it took a while to actually find this type of hay feeder that we use now that is minimal waste. And you put in what's called flakes. So out of each bale, you'll get maybe 5, 6, 7 or so flakes. It's like a thing you pull off, like a flat section of the hay, and they'll eat 1 to 2 of those a day. So the brand doesn't really matter. They're all pretty much the same thing. If you search hay rack or flake hay feeder, you'll see it. And it's kind of like a slanted design, which is really important for goats because they can't really get up under it and buck it off. And you just secure it with carabiner clips, little D clips. You could use zip ties, but I like the carabiners because you can move it around, which we've done a few times if it's raining or whatever, or we want to move around the goats. And that's the fun thing about homesteading, the details. I really love the details with alternative health, or as I call it, alternative health, because the details matter. And really it's the nuances and all the little pieces that stack and add up to create the big effect. That's very similar with homesteading, because it doesn't have to be a lot of work if you set it up right. That is really the important part. And that's actually a good segue into water. So your animals have to drink, and water is heavy. And so depending on where you put your enclosure, let's say for your goats, it's either going to make your life easier or harder. And so in a perfect world, you would actually trench, like with a backhoe, and put underground piping. And if you're in somewhere where the ground doesn't freeze, then it's a little easier because you don't have to dig as deep. But if you're somewhere like Idaho, where I am, then you actually have to dig deeper below where the ground freezes. And so the pipe will not freeze. And that costs a little extra, but it's totally worth it to have a frost-free spigot right at the animals. And some people actually do a trough design, and you could even divide it in between, and the animals share the trough because you have to separate the males and the females. Otherwise, the females can get roughed up because the bucks can be a little overly aggressive. And that way you don't have to carry buckets. But when you're just starting out, yeah, you can carry buckets of water. It's just be prepared that you might have to do that most likely twice a day. So it's quite the workout. And I laugh now homesteading because I don't like lifting weights. I've never liked lifting weights. It just seems really boring to me and unnatural. And, if you do it outside, that's one thing. That's a lot better because you're not breaking down bone tissue with artificial wavelength blue light. But if you homestead, you don't have to lift one weight again for the rest of your life because you're lifting water, you're lifting bales of hay. I mean, when I unload like 15 bales of hay, that is a full workout. And even if I do that once every 2 weeks, it's pretty much all I need. And then just light walking. I think over-exercising is a big issue. And I think that's why we have a lot of suppressed metabolisms in the world today, is because people are over-exerting themselves, especially with endurance exercise, like ultra marathon, triathlon, just running for miles and miles and miles. And even just excessive weightlifting even can do it, because you'll actually create an estrogenic effect. If you do just enough, then you can increase testosterone, both men and women, and that is very helpful for all the processes in the body. It's not just hormonal, it's very protective to your system. But if you overexert yourself chronically, especially with endurance, like running up and down a mountain because you think it's good for weight loss or whatever, you're going to increase your fat storage, because that is what estrogen does. Estrogen causes your body to store fat. And PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, increase estrogen. And 97% of all cancers are driven by estrogen. You have endometriosis, you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, ovarian cysts. All of these issues are driven by estrogen, which is driven by PUFA, and or overexerting yourself. And usually it's a combination, because if you overexert yourself and you have a lot of omega-3s stored in your fat and your adipose tissue, those are released into your system, and they will actually block glucose utilization in the cell, and it will cause this cascade of effects that causes induration, or the formation of scar tissue, also called fibrosis, which is the root cause of every disease. It shrinks your organs and basically decreases efficiency of all systems in the body. So a little tangent there, but it's all connected to human health, because obviously that's why we are homesteading and practicing animal husbandry and doing it right, instead of going the CAFO route, confined animal feeding operations, factory farms, because that's why I went vegan and vegetarian years ago, and raw vegan, because I thought that animal foods across the board were harmful to human health. But I was completely ignorant about the essential nature of retinol, vitamin A, and retinol's ability to load copper into ceruloplasmin, which is active copper, which then activates about 20 enzymes that are involved with oxygen and utilizing oxygen, and respiratory proteins, and generating energy. They're all copper dependent, oxidase enzymes. You need retinol to have your oxidase enzymes work, like CCO, cytochrome C oxidase, like all the red light therapy companies are talking about, because red light boosts cytochrome C oxidase, but it can't function if you're not consuming animal products, specifically butter, cheese, eggs, milk, all the stuff that the vegans say are mucus forming and acidic and all that garbage. It is not true. And the B vitamins, the water soluble B vitamins that a lot of vegans and vegetarians will supplement, especially B12, which I believe is overrated. Whatever happened to thiamine, riboflavin, niacinamide, B1, 2, and 3? Why aren't people taking those? And if they are, it's in puny, minuscule amounts that doesn't do anything. And they're slamming B12 like there's no tomorrow. Doesn't make sense to me. It's really the high dose niacinamide. In the clinical literature, it's called nicotinamide. That is where the benefit comes in, especially with skin issues, especially with fatigue, with energy issues. It's really the B3 And that's because it actually increases this thing called NAD, which is a energy precursor called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And niacinamide is a very affordable way to do that, just by taking 1 to 2 grams a day. I take 3 grams a day. So back to homesteading. If you live somewhere where it snows, like I mentioned, Idaho, where I'm at, then you have to account for the winter. Where is the snow going to fall? Are you going to have paths to plow? So when you're setting up your enclosure, you have to think about all of these things, even the pitch of the roof. So a slanted roof, which way are you going to slant it? And if you have multiple structures, you don't want them slanting into each other because then it could collapse one of the buildings. And you also want to have a structure, a place for the animals to go when it's snowing, for them to get out of the elements. So usually that's like a 3-walled shed just with a slanted roof. And again, if you're somewhere where it doesn't snow, then ignore all this. It's a little easier and you don't have to think about all this stuff. One of the mistakes that I made with keeping goats was the ground and keeping the barn clean. So the sleeping area of the goats. I just had a dirt for a while, for months and months. It was just dirt. And those poor goats, because they're pooping, they're sitting in their poop. Obviously, the udder is touching the feces, and that creates contamination probabilities. So up until very recently, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that the hay was their bedding. So all the hay that was falling off of that hay trough that I was using was on the floor, and it was just collecting moisture and maybe even mold, and I wasn't flipping it, and I wasn't using straw, yellow straw. That is the ideal bedding for goats because it's very dry, and so it can absorb a lot of moisture, and you just have to flip it. So that pitchfork thing, remember that from cartoons? You have to use that to flip the straw daily. And ideally you use a rake, and you'll rake their barn into 2 or 3 piles, and you'll look for wet spots, and you'll either remove those wet spots or you'll use stall freshener. It's this powder that you can buy that contains enzymes which actually eat the ammonia creating bacteria. So it'll actually keep your barn smelling good, but it'll actually get to the root of the issue. And a lot of this, like I was doing for months and months and months, overflowing my bucket because I had the drinking water bucket placed too low. And so my buck loved to poop in his drinking water. And because I had it hooked up to stay warm to electricity, so it had basically a metal band around it keeping the water from freezing, which is another issue you have to deal with in cold climates. Again, it's like, why even do it? This is so much work to do it in cold climates, but it is worth it because it's food security. And especially in a cold climate, I often like to think if everything went down and society collapsed, which is totally possible when you just look around and your brain is functioning, you could see that as a very real possibility. And famines have happened, and mass famines and mass starvations, like in Europe or Russia, these have happened. And so they will happen again. So food security, to me, is priceless. It's more important than having a really expensive car, more important than having a really expensive house. It's power security, it's water security, and it's food security, because we gotta eat. And obviously, if we don't eat, we cannot support our family, we cannot live our life. And somehow we forget how reliant we are on supermarkets and even the farmers market or even local farms. It's like, without these things, what would you do? You have to really start thinking about that. And that's why homesteading is really important, especially in these times where Bill Gates is buying up all of the farmland in the US and food quality is going down. And a big reason why I started homesteading was looking at the well water that most farms, if not all farms, are giving their animals. They don't care about the drinking water, right? No big deal. Just a ton of iron, a ton of calcium in the well water that you're giving your chickens and goats and sheep and pigs and cows. Hard water, no big deal, right? It only accumulates in the tissues and decreases the quality of the meat, increases the risk of parasitic infection, of any kind of infection. It's a big deal. And giving unfiltered water to your animals does not make sense, let alone your garden, which just goes direct in, right? Which is why I've made fun of the celery juice craze multiple times, because that celery juice, right? The medical medium celery juice challenge, you're just calcifying your brain. And this is creating future clients for me with the CLF protocol, because these people are calcified, they're fibrotic, and they're on a PUFA vegan diet, eating tons of nuts and seeds and supplementing algae oil. And it just creates neurodegeneration, dementia, Alzheimer's, brain fog, fatigue, just delusions of grandeur, weird behavior. The quality of our thoughts really is determined by the quality of our food and water. And it's not just enough to say, rewild yourself and drink spring water and eat wild game and you'll be super healthy, because there's a smoke ring around planet Earth from burning fossil fuels. And if you don't believe in that, let's just say bunker fuel, which is a real thing. And what comes up must come down, and it comes down in your water. It comes down in your soil. It comes down in your spring water, in your aquifers. And you drink that, and it accumulates in you, it accumulates in your animals, and it throws off the whole biogeochemical cycles. Throws off the bacteria in the soil, throws off the fungus. That's not to mention the fertilizer they're using, the biosludge, all the crazy stuff that's falling down on the soil, going into the roots. There's no fulvic acid. This is a big reason why I emphasize Shilajit, because the food is suboptimal. Even the wild food, it's a little better than the domesticated meat that you'll get. And I'm talking about bison, elk, venison, deer, moose. These are going to be generally better quality than your grass-fed cows, but nothing compares to food that you produce yourself at home, because you have control over every step of the process, especially the water quality that's going into it. So, talked about cleanliness of the barn, cleanliness of the goats. You're supposed to brush them every day and check for mites, check that their hooves are well formed. You have to actually trim their hooves, make sure they're flat on the bottom, maybe even shave them. They have all these tools at your farm stores. And one thing that took me years to get was giving the goats access to loose minerals and not the rocks. There's a misconception that I bought for months and months and nobody corrected me. A myth that goats should have those red salt rocks to lick. And that does not work well for goats, because they can't get the minerals off the rock because of the structure of their tongue. That's more for horses, not for goats. Goats actually need powdered minerals. And the quality, again, really matters. Generally, when you go with a smaller source, it'll be higher quality. And you don't want to get just your run-of-the-mill feed store mineral source. I would really research that. Try to find one fairly local. But again, you could probably just ship it from wherever. But try to get a high-quality mineral source. And the goats will actually convert these minerals. You might have heard goats can eat anything and digest it. It's pretty true. Their rumen is pretty fantastic. They can convert minerals to the usable form, just like cows can eat grass and convert those nutrients to bioavailable forms. that we then eat the animal flesh and we get that nutrition in bioavailable form that we can absorb. Same thing with the goats. So I wouldn't worry about the forms of minerals and all of that. That's more important for you, not for your goats. Baking soda is another one. So there's actually a hanging 2-compartment plastic, like two squares that you can hang on the fence. And in one, you put your loose minerals, your powdered minerals, and the other one, you put your baking soda. And the sodium bicarbonate baking soda is really good for the goats to have access to. If they have any kind of upset, they can actually graze on the baking soda, and that bicarbonate is really soothing to their digestive system. Another thing that took me a long time to figure out was my bucks. And I've tried wrestling my buck to the ground, and I got in trouble with some PETA people for that, which was really hilarious to me because I always said I'll lock them in with my male goat and, let's see them make friends, and I'll just watch and film it. But I joke because if you go in with a buck, generally they're going to be ramming you, and whether they want to play or assert dominance, whatever it is, they're different from does. When I go in with the does, they'll just kind of brush up on me and want their pets. With the buck, he's ramming me, he's trying to pin me into the wall. And there are videos where you can pull their legs out from under them, stand over them, and hold them there. And similar to how dogs assert dominance, you can do that with the bucks, with the male goats. That didn't seem to work with mine. Maybe I'll keep at it, but a very knowledgeable, decades and decades long goat farmer that I trust, she recommended Hot Shot. It's an electric prod, like a cattle prod. And it sounds cruel, but it's just battery operated, it's 2 metal prods. And that allows me to get into his enclosure so he's not sleeping in his poop. So I can, flip his hay. So I could add more minerals, add more baking soda. Ideally, you can do that over the fence if you set it up that way. But inevitably, you will have to get in his enclosure. So you want to have the ability to create distance between you and ideally lock your buck or all your animals in a separate area. So usually people will have multiple sections in their fenced area. So you can close off one section and you're in there, and your animals are in the other section. But it's the point now where I just hold that thing, or I don't even press the button to shock him, and I just put it towards him, and he sprints away because he remembers just that all it takes is one time, and now he remembers. And so that thing is so useful to have because you can get injured. Goats don't have like sharp teeth or anything, but those bucks get huge. And, a couple 100 pounds, they could do some damage. So that little Hot Shot, it's a little green device that I have, battery operated, has been really useful for me. So that's about it on goats. It's quite a bit of info, and I'm sure I'll have more to share in the future, but that's kind of just a crash course to goat keeping. Chickens are a lot easier. Chickens are what I started with. I actually did it illegally a few times with 2 rental properties and got in trouble with the landlords, which was very frustrating. It's like living with your parents. And I think the laws are very draconian. I think it's by design to make it harder for humans to feed ourselves. But I have seen chicken coops sold at Costco now, and you don't have to get a rooster, which that is the main thing. They make the loud hallmark sound, but you can just get hens and they'll be quiet, and you could even keep them, you could have a run, like an outdoor area, and then you could have the coop with all the nesting boxes where they lay the eggs. And it's very easy to keep chickens. We use pine shavings in their nesting boxes, and you just have to remember to clean out the poop because that, again, just like the goats, can raise the possibility of infection. And that poop is really rich in nitrogen. It's amazing for the garden and for composting. We actually raised 10 chicks from babies. So a certain time of year, you can go to your farm store and buy little baby chicks. And then you just get their little, usually it's a circular watering hole, and then a little, usually metal feeder. It's little holes in it. They could stick their heads in and eat their grain. And you just keep them usually in a Tupperware container with a little heat lamp over. And there's various schools of thought with the heat lamp. Whether that messes with their circadian rhythm or not is a topic of debate. But the main thing I've learned with keeping chickens is keeping them safe from predators, because we went from 10 hens down to 4. And that was within the span of about 2 to 3 weeks. We lost 6 chickens to predators, and we still didn't figure out what it was. Could have been birds of prey, could have been land animal, who knows. But one way to keep your chickens safe is to give them a lot of hiding areas. So if they're in an open area, just be sure to have things they could duck under and basically safe spaces. And if that's not available, or if you don't have the means to do that, then you can just always keep them locked up, but they make actually rolling chicken coops. So you can kind of rotational graze with the chickens and kind of roll that chicken coop around. And just make sure that they get a sufficient amount of sunlight or access to sunlight, but they also have access to shade. So that's the challenge of having them in one spot, is you just have to make sure it's set up in the right area so that the light environment is good and they can heat up or cool down as they want. But chickens, so much easier than goats. Pretty much they're doing all their own stuff. And you could even get automatic chicken doors. You could even run it on a solar setup to where the chicken door raises when it detects light and it closes when it gets dark. And the chickens know just to go on their roost when it gets dark or before dark. So they're all automatic, and you could set it up to where it's all automatic. You're really not doing much at all except just getting eggs and just cleaning it out every once in a while, shoveling out the old pine shavings and putting new stuff in. And that's pretty much it. So if you want to start homesteading, I would say chickens are the way to go. It's the place to start. Goats, if you enjoy cheese, if you enjoy milk, it's a little more advanced. But if you have the space for it and you could set up the fencing, then it's definitely worth it. And if you have eggs, milk, cheese, and if you stockpile honey, which will last forever, you can really live on those foods pretty much indefinitely. They have all the nutrition that humans require. Beekeeping is a thing that I've failed at a few times, largely because a black bear knocked down the hives a bunch of times. But that's where electric fencing comes in, or really protecting them from predators. But beekeeping is something that I'll make a future episode on once I figure out the proper way to do it. But that is another kind of like automatic thing if you set it up right, like the chickens with bees, to where it doesn't take much work. And you can have beeswax to make candles. You have your honey. You can get so much useful material from keeping bees. And it helps to support your local environment, because these are pollinators, right? And without them, plants cannot survive and replicate. So there's your crash course for homesteading. Been having a lot of fun with it, and definitely feeling the benefit in my overall health, in my cognition, in my mood. Everything just gets better when you feed the body nutrition that you've likely never had your entire life, because store-bought food does not compare to food that you produce yourself at home. So my website is matt-blackburn.com. I have all my recommended products up there, most of which have discount codes. And I have the featured products on the front page, but if you click the shop tab, then you can scroll through all of the products. And I actually just threw up there my espresso machine. It's called the Breville Barista machine. And this thing is amazing for making espresso shots or just making coffee. And I just uploaded a video to the Mitolife Academy on my current coffee recipe, where I use MCT, collagen, shilajit, a few other things to balance it out. Espresso with maple syrup is pretty balancing, but when you make a coffee and you have your protein in there and a good amount of fat, it's really nourishing, especially drank after a meal. It has a really beneficial effect on the system and can actually increase the metabolism instead of pushing the body into a stress state when you drink coffee on an empty stomach. So with this espresso machine that was recommended by some friends, I haven't had any issues. It's very easy to maintain, and it's just an awesome routine to have a shot after breakfast and get the benefits of coffee, which is beneficial on thyroid function, on progesterone, and really just on the body as a whole when you do it right. And I uploaded another video on my travel tips for driving and long car rides. And on my website, it's $130 or so. It's a Thera O3. It's an ozone and a negative ion generator. And that negative ion function is what I love to use in the car. So it's a portable negative ion generator that you can just set on the dash or set really anywhere in your car, and it will counteract the positive ions that's being kicked out by your AC unit or by the heat. And just having your windows up driving on the freeway, that's very taxing to your body's electrical system. So to pump the car full of negative ions really helps to counter that. And you just feel so much more energized when you reach your destination or when you get back home. You just feel less zapped and you're able to get more done. And that is always mitolife.co. That's my company, Mitolife. And you can purchase all my supplements there. I have Dissolve It All, Purely K, probiotic, niacinamide supplement called NAD powder, oyster extract, and dairy absorb, which if you have any issues with absorbing dairy and gaining the benefit in milk and cheese, then lactase enzyme can likely help you out. Lactase is what breaks the bond of glucose and galactose. That's called lactose. So the lactase enzyme actually breaks down that disaccharide sugar, and you can gain the benefit from dairy, which is huge. Not only the calcium, but the retinol and the B vitamins and the amino acids and all the other selenium and copper. There really is no replacement for dairy. So I just moved on to a fully off-grid home, and so homesteading just went to the next level. I'm sure I'll have extra tips for you in the next solo show about homesteading, but hopefully this crash course was helpful to you and you got some ideas, if not just inspiration, to work towards producing your own food at home. And there's so many resources out there, websites, YouTube videos. I have friends that are doing basically maggot buckets, which basically attracting flies. Those flies create maggots, and then those fall through holes in the buckets, like a 5-gallon bucket. And you can basically create your own endless chicken food. So the possibilities are literally endless. There's so many things you can do, and it's kind of fun to learn all the little techniques. And I would say it's really about making it where it's not taking up a lot of your energy, where it's pretty much automatic, it's efficient, and you don't have to do a ton of work to keep the operation going. So thanks so much for listening. New episode every Friday, and I will see you guys next week.